She broke every record that existed. She sold out buildings that hadn't seen a full crowd in years. She single-handedly forced television networks to renegotiate broadcast deals mid-season because the ratings were so absurd they couldn't be ignored. And when the Olympics came around, the single biggest stage in the entire sport, she wasn't on the plane. Let that contradiction sit with you for a moment. Caitlin Clark, the most culturally significant women's basketball player in the history of the sport, watched the Paris Olympics from home while Team USA competed without her. And the explanation handed to the public was simple, clean, and rehearsed. She just wasn't ready yet. Too young, too new to the international game. A developmental gap that made her, despite everything, not quite the right fit for this particular moment. That explanation has never held up. Not for the fans who watched every single game she played, not for the analysts who actually ran the numbers, and critically, not for the credentialed, respected, deeply connected figures inside women's basketball who took one look at that roster announcement and started asking questions that still haven't received straight answers. What actually happened during USA Basketball's 2024 selection process is a story that goes several layers deeper than anything the official narrative ever acknowledged. The accounts that have circulated through professional circles since that roster was announced, the public statements from people who have spent their careers inside this sport at the highest level, and the stark, uncomfortable contrast between Clark's Olympic exclusion and her record-obliterating WNBA rookie season, all point towards something far more complicated than a simple developmental assessment. This isn't a story about one roster decision. This is a story about power, about generational collision, about what happens when an institution built around a specific identity suddenly has to reckon with a force it wasn't designed to absorb. And the deeper you go on it, the less it looks like a basketball call, and the more it looks like something else entirely. We're connecting every dot today. Let's get into it. To understand what happened in April 2024, you first have to understand exactly what Caitlin Clark was walking into that training camp as. Because the gap between her public profile and the way she was apparently received inside that facility is one of the most important details in this entire story. Clark arrived at USA Basketball's training camp as a 22-year-old who had just completed the most decorated college basketball career in the history of the sport. Not the most decorated women's college career, the most decorated college career, period. Men's or women's. No asterisk, no qualifier, no footnote. She finished at Iowa as the all-time leading scorer in NCAA history, breaking a record that had stood for decades and was widely assumed to be untouchable. But the numbers only tell part of it. What Clark actually did to women's college basketball during her time at Iowa went beyond statistics. She transformed the entire visibility of the sport. Games that previously drew modest television audiences were suddenly pulling numbers that embarrassed programs with far longer broadcast histories. Arenas that had comfortable but unremarkable attendance figures started selling out weeks in advance. Merchandise moved at rates the NCAA hadn't seen from women's basketball. A demographic of viewers who had previously never engaged with women's college sports started showing up, tuning in, and investing emotionally in the game because of one specific player. By the time she declared for the WNBA draft, the cultural machinery around Caitlin Clark had grown into something genuinely unprecedented. She wasn't just a highly regarded prospect, she was a phenomenon. The kind of athlete who comes along once in a generation, maybe once in a sport's entire history, and fundamentally changes the equation of what that sport can be. She was the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft, Indiana Feeler, and everything that happened next in her professional career only made the Olympic exclusion more baffling in retrospect. But before we get to what she did in her rookie season, we need to talk about what happened inside that training camp, because that's where the real story starts, and it's a story that the official version of events never came close to telling honestly.
USA Basketball's training camps don't operate like a typical tryout. There is a structure in place that goes back decades, built on a foundation of seniority, continuity, and a veteran-led culture that the program's leadership has always treated as a core part of its identity. That culture produced results. It built a dynasty that dominated international women's basketball for so long that winning gold medals started feeling like a formality rather than an achievement. None of that is up for debate. The program earned its reputation, and the coaches and players who built it deserve full credit for what they accomplished.
But cultures don't just produce results. They also produce hierarchies. They produce loyalties. They produce unwritten rules about how things work and who fits and what kind of player earns her place versus what kind of player represents a disruption to the established order. And when you build something dominant enough for long enough, those hierarchies can calcify into something that functions less like a merit system and more like a gatekeeping structure. That's the environment Caitlin Clark walked into in April 2024. Multiple insiders who were around the facility during that camp period have described an atmosphere that went beyond the expected intensity of elite competition. What sources close to the program have indicated since the roster announcement isn't the picture of an evaluation process designed to identify the best possible team. What circulated through professional basketball circles afterward described something that felt, to people paying close attention, more like a test of whether Clark would push back against a structure that had already decided what it thought of her. The accounts that emerged after the roster was announced describe a program environment that was cold in ways that couldn't be fully explained by normal veteran-rookie dynamics. Every elite sports environment has some version of that friction. Established players don't automatically embrace newcomers. Pecking orders exist. Younger players are expected to earn their place. That's standard. But what sources suggest about Clark's experience went beyond standard. Reports that circulated through professional circles describe an environment where her questions were unwelcome, where her presence registered less as a tremendous asset and more as an intrusion on an established order that wasn't interested in being rearranged, where the scrutiny applied to her felt less like rigorous evaluation and more like a sustained effort to identify reasons to maintain a conclusion that may have already been reached. The phrase that has come up repeatedly in conversations among people connected to the program and to women's basketball professionally is that the environment wasn't designed for what Clark represented. And that framing is worth sitting with because it points towards something specific. This wasn't a situation where a young player came in raw and unpolished and got a fair assessment and came up short. This was a situation where a player came in representing an entirely different vision of what women's basketball could look like commercially, culturally, and generationally, and found herself inside an institution that hadn't built any framework for handling that kind of disruption. Head coach Cheryl Reeve made the final call. That much is documented and undisputed. Reeve is a legitimate, accomplished basketball mind. Her coaching record is real, her credentials are legitimate, and dismissing her qualifications entirely would be intellectually dishonest. Accomplished coaches make defensible decisions all the time that still end up being wrong, and the line between a defensible decision and the right decision isn't always clear until the evidence piles up afterward. What we know for certain is that Clark didn't make the roster. What sources close to the program have suggested since is that the outcome felt settled well before the public evaluation process implied it was still open. The image of a rigorous, genuinely open competition where every candidate was assessed equally on basketball merit and the best team was assembled. Multiple people with professional knowledge of the situation have cast significant doubt on whether that image matched reality. When the roster was announced, the public reaction was immediate and intense. But fan frustration, even widespread fan frustration, can be dismissed. Emotional audiences aren't always tracking the same things the professionals are tracking. The part of the reaction that couldn't be dismissed so easily was what came from inside the sport itself.
Nancy Lieberman didn't hold back. If you don't know who Nancy Lieberman is, here's the short version. She is one of the most important figures in the entire history of women's basketball. Hall of Famer, pioneer, a woman who has spent her entire adult life operating at the highest levels of this sport as a player, a coach, and a commentator with genuine credibility in every room she enters. She is not someone who speaks carelessly. She is not someone who tosses around accusations for attention or because she got caught up in a fan-driven emotional wave. When Nancy Lieberman steps in front of cameras and makes it plain that the process that left Caitlin Clark at home raised questions that deserved real, direct answers, that is not noise. That is a signal from inside the institution itself. That is someone with decades of credibility and access choosing to use that credibility to say publicly what others were saying privately. Something about this wasn't right.
Lieberman wasn't alone. The credentialed pushback that followed the roster announcement came from multiple directions, from analysts with professional track records, from former players with legitimate basketball knowledge, from figures who had no emotional investment in Caitlin Clark specifically, but who looked at the decision and couldn't reconcile it with what they were seeing on the court. That's the part of the story that the "she just wasn't ready" explanation never adequately addressed. It's one thing for fans to be upset. It's another thing entirely for respected basketball lifers to publicly question whether the process was clean. Those two reactions have completely different implications, and the people running Team USA's public communications never produced a response that adequately addressed the second one. The question that kept getting asked in various forms and from various credible sources was this: by what specific basketball criteria was Caitlin Clark not ready for the Paris Olympics? What measurable, articulable gap in her game made her, despite everything the evidence showed about her talent and her impact, not the right fit for this specific roster? The answers that came back were vague, were framed around developmental timelines and system fits, and the adjustment curve involved in transitioning from college to international competition. Those are real considerations. They apply to every young player making that transition. But they don't specifically explain why Clark, given what she had already demonstrated, fell below the threshold while other selections cleared it. And that gap between the question being asked and the answer being provided is itself informative. There's another layer to this story that a lot of coverage has danced around without engaging with directly. It involves a dynamic that had been building for years before the 2024 Olympic selection process ever began, and it created a subtext inside that training camp that multiple sources say nobody in a position of authority was actively managing. The tension between Caitlin Clark and certain established figures in the women's basketball ecosystem is documented. It isn't speculation, it isn't fan-generated drama, and it didn't start in the professional ranks. It traces back to her college career, to moments during March Madness and beyond, where the attention and the adulation that followed Clark wherever she went created friction with players who had been operating at elite levels for years without anything close to that kind of cultural recognition. That friction has a specific character to it that makes it complicated to talk about honestly without being reductive. It isn't simply jealousy, though that element almost certainly exists in some form. It's more accurately described as a collision between two completely different relationships with visibility, with commercial power, and with what it means to be the face of women's basketball at a given moment in time. The established veterans of women's basketball built their careers during an era when the sport operated under a completely different set of cultural and commercial conditions. They competed at the highest level, they won championships, they represented their country internationally, and they did all of it in relative obscurity compared to what Clark generated during a single college season. That disparity between what they accomplished and the attention they received versus what Clark accomplished and the attention she received created a psychological and political reality inside the sport that was always going to need careful management. Nobody managed it. That's the specific failure that sources close to the situation have pointed toward. Not that the tension existed, because tension of that kind is almost inevitable when generational change hits a sport this fast, but that the coaching staff and program leadership around Team USA's training camp apparently hadn't developed any framework for navigating it. Two distinct eras of women's basketball were colliding in the same facility, and the people in charge of the environment let that collision happen without any real structure around it. What that created, according to accounts from people with professional knowledge of the situation, was a dynamic where Clark's experience at camp was shaped not just by her basketball performance, but by the political and social climate surrounding her presence there. And that climate was not neutral. It was not simply competitive. It carried the weight of years of accumulated tension that nobody with authority had chosen to address. In that context, the question of whether Clark received a genuinely fair, purely merit-based evaluation becomes even harder to answer affirmatively. And the people asking that question most pointedly haven't been random fans on social media. They've been people who understand, from professional experience, how those kinds of dynamics play out inside elite sports environments.
Now let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the official explanation doesn't just strain credibility, it breaks down entirely. While Team USA was in Paris winning gold medals, Caitlin Clark was in the middle of the most statistically and commercially extraordinary rookie season in WNBA history. Let's be specific about what that looked like. The Indiana Fever's attendance figures during Clark's rookie year hit levels the franchise hadn't seen in years. Not modest improvements, dramatic, historic jumps in people showing up to watch basketball in person. Road games Clark was playing in opposing teams' arenas, were selling out weeks in advance. Cities that had historically treated WNBA matchups as secondary sporting events were suddenly seeing their buildings packed because Caitlin Clark was coming to town. The television numbers were even more revealing. National broadcast partners who had locked in their WNBA coverage plans months earlier were upgrading Clark games on the fly, expanding broadcast windows, adding studio coverage, adjusting promotional resources mid-season because the ratings were demanding it. Not occasionally, not as a one-time spike that faded after the novelty wore off. Consistently, week after week, through the full arc of her rookie season, Caitlin Clark was pulling viewership numbers that the WNBA hadn't seen in 30 years. 30 years. That number needs to land properly. This isn't a player who produced a ratings bump. This is a player who dragged women's professional basketball to an audience level it hadn't touched since the late 1990s, when the league was brand new and novelty was driving the numbers. Clark did it during her first professional season, while still learning the speed of the professional game, while adjusting to a completely new competitive environment, while handling a media and public scrutiny load that no WNBA player in history had ever faced. Now hold both of those realities in your head at the same time. Team USA determined in April 2024 that Caitlin Clark was not ready for Olympic competition, not polished enough, not developed enough at the international level, not quite the right fit for this particular roster at this particular moment. And simultaneously, that same player was in the middle of transforming women's professional basketball in a way that nobody in the sport's history had ever accomplished. Those two things cannot both be true and have the selection process be clean. There is no version of the logic where a player is simultaneously not ready for the Olympic stage and the single most transformative commercial force in the entire history of women's basketball. Either the selection process was evaluating something other than Clark's overall value to the sport, which raises its own significant questions about what criteria were actually being applied, or the program made a miscalculation of historic proportions that will be discussed and debated for the next decade. Pick one, because both can't be true at the same time. The explanation that is circulated most persistently among people with professional knowledge of the situation isn't a purely technical one. It isn't primarily about defensive scheme fit or transition timelines or the specific adjustments required to move from college ball to EBA-LOL international competition. Those are the publicly stated rationales, and they contain enough basketball-adjacent logic to sound plausible on the surface. What the accounts from inside professional women's basketball actually point toward looks less like selection criteria and more like something that has a very specific name: institutional self-preservation. Here's what that means in practice. Team USA's women's basketball program was built by a specific generation of players and coaches who operated under a specific set of values and loyalties and who created something genuinely dominant. That dominance became the program's identity, and identities, once they're established at that level, develop their own gravitational pull. They start to organize everything around maintaining themselves: who fits, who doesn't, who represents continuity, who represents disruption. Caitlin Clark represented disruption on a scale the program had never encountered. This wasn't a highly talented young player who needed to learn the system and pay her dues before earning her place. This was a player whose cultural footprint already eclipsed the entire program's previous visibility before she ever played a professional game. A player whose commercial impact was so significant that networks were restructuring broadcast deals around her. A player who was, by any honest commercial and cultural measure, already the face of women's basketball regardless of whether Team USA chose to include her or not. That kind of player doesn't just challenge the existing hierarchy, she reorganizes it by existing. She changes what the public conversation is about, changes who the cameras follow, changes where the money flows. And institutions that have been built around a specific power structure don't always respond to that kind of reorganization rationally, even when the people running those institutions are genuinely accomplished and genuinely well-intentioned.
What the accounts from professional circles suggest is that the 2024 selection process happened inside an environment where Clark's presence was experienced not primarily as an asset to be maximized, but as a threat to an established order that wasn't ready to cede ground. Where the cultural and commercial power she represented was processed, consciously or not, as something that needed to be contained rather than embraced. That's a damning framing. And it's one that the program's public communications have never directly addressed, because directly addressing it would require acknowledging that the process involved factors beyond basketball merit. But the persistence of the skepticism, coming from credentialed insiders and not just emotionally invested fans, suggests that this framing has resonance with people who actually know how the institution operates from the inside. Here's one of the most telling details in the entire story, and it's easy to overlook because it happened after everything was already settled. The conversation about Caitlin Clark's absence from the Paris Olympics never stopped. Not during the quarterfinals, not during the semifinals, not during the gold medal game, not after the ceremony, not during the celebration coverage, not in the weeks that followed as the Olympic narrative typically fades from the sports conversation and the next thing takes over. Every highlight package from Paris ran in parallel with a persistent, ongoing, professional-grade debate about whether the process that left Clark at home was legitimate. Sports media figures who cover women's basketball professionally kept returning to the question. Former players and coaches with genuine credibility in the sport kept weighing in. The public conversation never collapsed into simple fan frustration and moved on. It sustained itself at a level of seriousness that is itself evidence of something. Fan frustration fades. Emotional reactions to roster decisions cycle out of the discourse relatively quickly because new storylines replace them. What doesn't fade, what keeps generating serious conversation months and years later, is a genuine, unresolved question about whether something significant went wrong. And that's what the Clark exclusion produced. Not a frustrated fan base that eventually accepted the outcome, but a persistent, credentialed, substantive debate that continued well past the point where it should have resolved if the official explanation were truly satisfying. That sustained doubt is its own form of evidence. It tells you that the people most qualified to evaluate the decision, the ones with professional knowledge of what Olympic team selection actually involves and what standards are actually applied, looked at this outcome and couldn't fully reconcile it with what they knew about the player and the process. And it sets up the next chapter of this story in a very specific way. 2028, Los Angeles. Home soil.
If Paris was complicated, the 2028 Olympics carries a level of stakes that makes everything that happened in 2024 look like a preliminary skirmish. Los Angeles is the biggest possible stage for American athletes in a generation. It's the Olympics on home ground, with home crowds, in a media environment where every decision about Team USA's roster will receive maximum possible scrutiny from the jump. And between now and then, there is a question that cannot be avoided, cannot be managed away with careful public communications, and cannot be resolved by simply hoping the discourse moves on. The question of who actually controls Team USA's identity in the post-Clark era of women's basketball. The legacy veterans who built the current dynasty have legitimate claims to respect and influence. The coaching infrastructure that has run the program through its dominant period has real credentials and real accomplishments. But women's basketball in 2028 is going to look fundamentally different from women's basketball in any previous Olympic cycle. The commercial landscape has shifted, the audience has shifted, the cultural visibility of the sport has reached levels that would have seemed impossible to predict just 5 years ago, and the primary driver of that shift is Caitlin Clark. The new generation of fans who arrived in the sport because of Clark aren't going to quietly accept another exclusion. They aren't going to be satisfied with vague answers about developmental timelines and system fit. They've watched this player operate at an elite level. They've seen what she produces when the stage is largest, and they have a legitimate question about whether the people making decisions about Team USA's future have fully absorbed the reality of the era they're now operating in.
Clark has been measured, professional, and focused on her Indiana Fever career in every public appearance since Paris. She hasn't publicly accused anyone of anything. She hasn't engaged in the kind of direct confrontation that would give her critics easy material to work with. She has, by every public measure, handled an extraordinarily difficult and genuinely unfair situation with more grace than most people in her position would manage. But the evidence doesn't require her to make public accusations for the picture to be clear. The documented camp environment, the credibility of the figures who pushed back publicly, the logical impossibility of squaring not ready with the most transformative rookie season in league history, all of it points toward a conclusion that the official story cannot fully account for. What happened with Caitlin Clark and Team USA in 2024 looks, from every angle the evidence allows, like the first major collision between the old structure of women's basketball and the new reality that Clark represents. Two incompatible visions of what the sport is, who it's for, and who gets to lead it through the next era, meeting inside a training facility in April 2024, with the coaching staff either unable or unwilling to manage the collision honestly. The old structure won that round. Clark went home. Team USA went to Paris. Gold medals were won. But the collision didn't end there. It just went underground, where it's been building pressure ever since. And 2028 is when that pressure has to go somewhere. Here's the thing about genuine historical moments. They rarely look like what they are while they're happening. The people inside them are too close to the details, too invested in their own positions, too focused on the immediate outcome to see the larger shape of what's unfolding. What happened with Caitlin Clark and Team USA in 2024 is going to look, with the benefit of hindsight, like the moment when the old era of women's basketball made its last significant stand against the new one. The moment when the institutions that had governed the sport through its previous chapter tried to absorb a generational shift on their own terms, and discovered that the shift was bigger than anything they had tools to manage. The gold medal from Paris is real. The dynasty is real. The credentials of the people who made the 2024 roster decision are real. None of that is in dispute. But the player they sent home went on to produce a rookie season that redefined what the entire sport was commercially capable of. The fans who followed that player aren't going anywhere. The networks that restructured broadcast deals around her aren't going back.
The audience that found women's basketball through Caitlin Clark didn't find it through Team USA's gold medal run in Paris. They found it through one specific player, and they're loyal to her in a way that goes beyond ordinary sports fandom. That's the reality the program has to reckon with before 2028. Not just whether to include Clark on the roster, though that decision will be scrutinized at a level the program has never previously experienced, but whether the fundamental approach to managing women's basketball's new era is one that the existing leadership is capable of executing. The outcome of the 2024 selection process was a power play dressed up as a development decision. The evidence, assembled carefully and honestly, points in that direction with more force than the official narrative can deflect. And the people who made that call are going to answer for it on a stage far larger than anything Paris provided. Caitlin Clark will be there in 2028. The only question is what role she plays, and whether the institution that shut her out in 2024 has learned enough from what followed to make a different call when it matters most. The first collision is history. The second one is coming. And this time, the whole world is going to be watching.